Welcome on board the Newstrack. On the show this evening, two heavyweight voices with opposing points of view. The Chief Economic Advisor in the Government of India, Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian, will be speaking first, and then we'll have former Finance Minister, heavyweight from the UPA government, Mr. P. Chidambaram, presenting an alternate point of view of the current state of the Indian economy, the devastation caused as a result of the second wave of the COVID pandemic, and the speed of economic recovery from your questions that are central to each of our lives. And that's our top focus on the Newstrack.
Biggest contraction in GDP. Unemployment rate soars. Second wave cripples recovery. Slowdown fears loom. Only pandemic to blame? KV Subramanian versus P. Chidambaram. The big Newstrack showdown.
The Government of India has said that the Indian economy last year contracted by 7.3%. The big question in the minds of everyone who's watching is about the impact that the second wave of the pandemic has had on the Indian economy in this year and the growth projections going forward. Because the sooner we're able to get the economy back on track, the sooner people are able to get back to work, the sooner life will start returning to normal. But that also runs the risk of the pandemic rearing its ugly head again. To talk about where the Indian economy is at this moment, the loss to the first quarter of this year, and what may happen in the months to come, I'm joined on this broadcast by the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, Krishnamurthy Subramanian. Welcome, sir. It's very good to have you with us on the Newstrack.
Very good evening to all our viewers and to you, Rahul.
The numbers you put out yesterday said that the GDP growth for 2021 was at a contraction of 7.3%. We've now done with April, we're done with May. From what you're picking up so far, what's your best sense of the impact that the second wave of the COVID pandemic has had on India's growth numbers in the first quarter of this year, sir? Welcome.
Rahul, before we talk about that, it is important to analyze the fourth quarter numbers. After the decline in the first quarter of 24.4%, there has been a progressive improvement with the gross value added in the fourth quarter being 3.6%. And emphasizing the gross value added because of the significant change in the accounting method, and that's, for the third and the fourth quarter, that is the right measure to look at. Especially if you look at also construction sector had grown by about 15%, and that's important because it provides jobs to the informal, in the informal sector, the urban poor. There was also significant increase in the gross fixed capital formation in the economy. So overall, up until March, the recovery had proceeded very well. Of course, the last 2 months, which is your April and May, have been impacted because of the second wave of the pandemic. And if you look at the high frequency indicators, many of the mobility indicators have declined in the month of April and May, but have started picking up again over the last 10 days. If you look at the e-way bills and the power sector, power demand, even on a year-to-year basis, so that any seasonality is accounted for, and we have to do doing an apples-to-apples comparison. Over the last 10 days, things have started picking up, which is reflecting the fact that the second wave is on its decline. And I think a pertinent point here is that if you look at the second wave, the pace of rise was very, very swift. At the same time, the pace of the decline has been equally swift as well. So I expect, therefore, that in this month, and today is the first day, of course, many of the states should go into easing of their restrictions. One important aspect that we must remember when we look at the impact on the economy is that these set of restrictions were more, driven by states, and therefore were asynchronous and were heterogeneous as well, especially in terms of the timing of the restrictions. and that is something that will have basically its impact in ensuring that the impact will not be as large as it was in the
So in the first quarter of last year, the economy contracted by 24%, but that was also a total lockdown. Nobody really knew what COVID was about, and therefore everything just froze. This time, many of the supply chains which had earlier packed up have still been open. The wheels of the economy have been trudging along, even if they're not been galloping along. How would you compare the impact on the economy in the first quarter of this year with that of the first quarter of last year, which is when we had a total lockdown, very different from what we've seen this year?
So, Rahul, as you rightly pointed out, last year around this time, there was a lot of uncertainty because, how would the response, the health response be? Doctors, for instance, started using a lot of ventilation and then discovered that it was not required as much. So, the economy has moved from a situation of unknown unknowns to known unknowns. There is certainly uncertainty now, but it's not as much as around the last time. The other important point, and we've been looking at other countries that have had second waves as well. One of the key things that stands out is the economic impact of the second wave in other countries that have experienced second and third waves has not been as has not manifested as much as the first wave, precisely because countries have learned to deal or work around the pandemic, and therefore the impact.
No, but the
has
one
not
difference and the one variable in comparing India with some of the other countries which also witnessed a second wave is the speed of vaccination. Our population is much bigger, even though in sheer terms of the jabs that are being administered, the numbers rank well, but as a percentage of the population, the numbers are so low that when you compare with a country like the US or even the UK, our overall percentage of the population vaccinated, which is also very crucial in determining how fast the economy can start opening up, is at this moment at a much lower threshold than internationally, and therefore it's not directly comparable what happened in the US, UK with a country like India at this moment.
That may be true, but I do want to point out, if you look at the percentage of the population that has received its first dose, and I do look at that aspect, because if you read a lot of the research that has come in epidemiology, there is a significant impact that is coming on average from the first dose itself. So if you look at, for instance, in the United States, across the various states, the impact of the first dose on actual death rates is significant. And India has vaccinated about 15% of the population has gotten the first dose. The second dose is about 5%, less than 5% or so. I'm talking about on average, and with the emphasis now on expanding supply. And I think this remains the most important. I have been mentioning this earlier as well. If you would have been following the monthly economic reports that the ministry puts out as well, the importance of vaccination has been emphasized repeatedly. So the acceleration in the progress of vaccination is by far most critical, because again, I go back to, if you look at the Q4 numbers, the fact that consumption grew at about 2.7% after having declined for 3 quarters. And if you look at the investment itself, gross fixed capital formation increasing by about 10.8%. That was because the fear of the pandemic had reduced significantly, and that is quite critical going forward as well. And therefore, vaccination and accelerating the progress of vaccination is very important. Here, I think the first dose, as I mentioned, will play its part, but we certainly have to actually go about doing the full vaccination program at a higher pace.
So we've spoken about the macroeconomy numbers. Let's now come down to what's happening to individuals and their finances. The one indicator that we have is that the per capita GDP is now down to numbers last seen in 2016-17, which is 99,700, which is India's total GDP per capita divided by the population. So therefore, if you were to look at per capita GDP numbers, we're now in a spot where countries like Bangladesh are ahead of us. What are you making of this decline? The fact that while it's hit government finances, most certainly, individual finances have been very badly impacted as well. How concerned are you about that?
So Rahul, this has to be seen in the context of the exceptional period that the global economy has been experiencing. Last year, the IMF's economic report had pointed out that if you look at the number of countries where GDP per capita is on a decline, that proportion is at a 150-year high. I think that is something that you have to keep in mind. There has been a decline, as you have seen in yesterday's numbers, 7.3%, which has been better than the revised estimates, that the second advanced estimates of 8%. But still 6.3% decline, which has had an impact on the numerator that you talked about. So your numerator has basically declined and the denominator has grown at 1.5–2%, and therefore this is just the arithmetic. I think the recovery that has happened since the first quarter is something that does give us encouragement that once the effect of the pandemic, the second wave, is lower, then the economy should be back, and some of the pent-up demand also should come back. If you notice, as I was mentioning, consumption did increase in the fourth quarter by about 2.7% because of the spending that happened on construction sector, the overall infrastructure spending, and that is an emphasis that the country has placed through its economic policy, which will help in accelerating.
So you mentioned, Dr. Subramanian, pent-up demand, and if the economy, once the second wave gets over and things start opening up, is to bounce back, pent-up demand will be very important. But the flip side to this is, given the high fatality, given the high medical bills that people have run up, given the distress, given the unemployment, the financial condition of the Indian household may be such that pent-up demand that you're banking on may not immediately materialize, because there is unlike the first wave where you were locked down but you didn't feel the pinch yourself, here many families, many seeing this broadcast at this time, have felt the death, the devastation, the misery and the financial expenses too.
So here's where I would go back to the budget this year, which was commended across the board for the expansionary stance that was taken by the government in trying to increase expenditure, especially expenditure on infrastructure, on construction activity. As we've discussed just now, that has had its impact in the fourth quarter. Eventually, when you look at the evidence, sustained growth comes from investment, especially private investment, that is crowded in by public sector investment in infrastructure. And the government in its budget had actually taken this into account and has taken a significantly expansionary stance. The impact of that will indeed come in. You have to keep in mind that despite the local restrictions in the month of April, the core measure of infrastructure production had recorded a growth of 56% in the month of April. Of course, has been through a lower base as of last year, but still the emphasis on infrastructure is certainly there, and which will create jobs in the informal sector, and that is the way to really put money in the hands of people and enable the economic recovery.
What are you making of the joblessness numbers that have come out? The Center for Monitoring of Indian Economy estimates that since the beginning of the pandemic last year, 97% of Indian households have seen a decline in their incomes, and 10 million Indians have lost their job because of the second wave of the COVID pandemic. Do you agree with these assessments? How concerned are you? What's the government's plan to fix the employment situation?
Rahul, I must point out that a senior official in the ministry that works in my team had written a very, very nice piece in the Economic Times, pointing out some of the inadequacies in the survey methodologies of CMI, on the employment front. For instance, if a smell test that is quite critical, employment changes should correlate with economic growth, which it does not in the case of the CMI. In contrast, the periodic labor force survey, PLFS, indeed does. So, I would actually wait for the PLFS numbers. I think there is no denying that there will be some impact of the second wave, on this. But I think the numbers have to be from a reliable source for us to actually take this into account. As I said, yesterday as well in my press briefing, the overall impact of the second wave is not likely to be very large. It is certainly going to be there, but not very large, given the fact that it is, a shorter time period, very high, a peak, and then actually a very fast pace of decline as well. So once the restrictions are removed and economic activity comes back, which is indeed what happened, and if you recall, after the first quarter numbers had come, I had indeed mentioned that there will be a recovery, and I'm glad to mention that indeed did transpire, based on the economic assessments. So I see no reason why, once the restrictions are removed now as well, that economic activity should come back, and that should enable the recovery, that had been happening up till March. Some of the momentum has been affected because of the second wave, but once the second wave, actually the decline happens fully, I think the economic activity should come back, and the recovery should proceed along.
Are you concerned about the urban joblessness rate? Because while rural joblessness is actually not as much of a concern, in urban areas, from what CMIE is saying, and you're contesting those numbers, there's the urban joblessness rate was about 18% in the week that ended the 30th of May, which is 3% more than a fortnight ago. So they're essentially saying that during the second wave in urban areas, and typically a formal job is something that takes much longer to come back than an informal job, and therefore some of this urban joblessness will stay for much longer than rural joblessness. Even if you contest the actual figures or the percentages, intuitively this does make sense that it takes tougher to create a job in a formal economy, and it takes lesser time for a job to come back in the informal economy.
Rahul, let me first clarify that, as I make careful work, I am contesting the methodology numbers. Eventually, it's the process leads to the product, and as I have already described, that there is, a significant amount of fixing in the process that needs to, and therefore I would not rely on those numbers as much. That said, I think, as did happen in the first wave as well, I have reason to believe that there will be an impact, and I think if we've acknowledged that. The one important factor that I will mention is, if you looked at the fourth quarter, construction sector actually grew by 15%. And that was because of the emphasis on infrastructure spending, especially by the government. So, once the pandemic, the second wave of the pandemic has played its course, and construction activity picks up because of the front loading of infrastructure spending, you will see urban poor, especially informal sector, getting a lot of push through the construction activity. And once the recovery comes back, I think the impact should also be there on the formal sector jobs as well, because do notice that investment spending, the fixed capital formation in the economy, did pick up significantly, in the fourth quarter, and a good part of that, of course, was through the government, but about half of the growth in the fixed capital formation in the economy was through the private sector. And eventually it is the investment-driven growth that is a sustained one, and it should manifest, as it did before the second wave actually robbed some of the momentum.
What are your models telling you? What are the numbers that you're projecting for the entire year? We saw the IMF, that's before the second wave really took off, predicted that the Indian economy would grow at 11.5%. Now we're seeing numbers from SBI at 7.9%, from CARE 8.8 to 9%, RBI 10.5%. The economic survey that you put together said 11.5%. Where are you at this moment?
Just a quick correction, we said 11% in the economic survey. As I mentioned yesterday in the press conference, we have evaluated, early April, we had looked at two different scenarios, one of which where the pandemic peaks around mid-May, and the other a more worst case scenario where the pandemic actually peaks in mid-June. So now the actual path of the pandemic seems to resemble more the former scenario, which is the peak around mid-May. And based on that, we've estimated, I would not give you a specific range because of the significant uncertainty there is. There will be some impact, but I would definitely mention that the impact is unlikely to be very large.
Okay. There's been a big demand for cash transfers. There's been a demand from industry that the government must print more money, that there must be a stimulus. If not now, when? These questions have been asked in the past, they're being asked again.
So, I would mention here that the budget, which is a budget for not just for a couple of months, but for the full year, was a significantly expansionary one. As the revised numbers have come in, the fiscal deficit is 9.3% for the last year and has been projected at at much higher than what was earlier thought of for this year as well. So the budget is an expansionary one with an emphasis on capital spending, on infrastructure spending, which should definitely boost the construction sector as well. The other important observation that I would make is if you look at the contact sensitive sectors as well, the travel, tourism, etc. Q4, after having declined significantly, for instance, by about 8% in Q3 and even more in the previous years, in the fourth quarter, it had declined only by about 2.3, 2.4%, which tells you again that the fear of the pandemic is what is really critical for these sectors, the demand in these sectors to come back, which again, highlights the importance of the vaccination program. As I'm sure you've been reading about in the media, the is emphasizing on increasing supply significantly, and there's also from what I've read, the plan to try and increase the daily count to about 1 crore doses a day, all of which will help in really pushing the vaccination and thereby reduce the fear of the pandemic, which is what is really critical for all the sectors, especially the service sectors, also to come back in terms of their recovery.
I'd leave it over there, Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian, for joining us with your thoughts on the state of the Indian economy and the roadmap from here. Thank you very much. That's the government's chief economist.